Her whisper wasn't supposed to reach my soul, but it did. In one quiet breath, my friend's mother said something she was never supposed to know, something I had buried deep enough to disappear forever. And in that moment, I realized she had been watching me long before I ever noticed her. The first time I really noticed her, it wasn't because anything dramatic happened. It was something much quieter, almost forgettable on the surface. I was standing in the hallway of my friend's house, the kind of place I had been visiting for years without ever thinking twice about it. Same faded walls, same familiar smell of detergent mixed with afternoon tea, same distant sound of a television playing in another room. Everything about it felt normal, predictable in a way that made you stop paying attention. Until her. She walked in from the kitchen holding a cup, moving with a calmness that didn't belong to the noise of the world around her. She was in her early 40s, but there was nothing rushed or heavy about her presence. It was controlled, graceful, like she had learned over time how to exist without needing to announce herself. When she saw me, she didn't act surprised, just a soft, knowing nod, as if my presence was already part of her mental map of the house. "You're here early today," she said gently. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried in a way that made me listen more carefully than I intended to. "Yeah, just helping him with some stuff," I replied a little too quickly. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer to the small table near the hallway and placed the cup down. The sound of ceramic touching wood was oddly clear in the silence between us. Then she turned slightly, and for a brief moment, her eyes stayed on me longer than they should have. Not staring, not judging, just observing. It made me strangely aware of myself, like I had walked into a version of the room I didn't fully understand yet. "You look tired," she said after a pause. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement, calm and steady, like she was reading something I hadn't said out loud. I almost laughed it off. "I'm fine." But she didn't accept the answer. Instead, she gave the faintest tilt of her head, the kind of gesture that felt less like disbelief and more like understanding something I wasn't ready to admit. Then she did something small, something I didn't expect to remember later. She passed by me to reach the hallway shelf, and for a second, her hand lightly brushed my arm. Not intentional enough to call it touch, but not careless either. Just a passing contact, soft and brief, like the edge of a thought. Yet it stayed. Long after she moved away, I was still standing there, wondering why something so simple had felt different. She didn't look back. She didn't make it meaningful. But I did. And that was the problem. Because in that quiet house, in that ordinary afternoon, I had the uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't just visiting my friend anymore. I was being noticed. After that first day, I told myself nothing had changed. It was just my imagination. Just a normal visit to a friend's house. Nothing more. But the problem with subtle things is that they don't announce themselves. They grow quietly, in places you don't immediately check. I started noticing her differently, or maybe she had always been like this and I was only now paying attention. She didn't behave in a way that crossed any clear line. In fact, everything she did still looked perfectly normal from the outside. But normal doesn't always feel normal when it starts to carry weight. One afternoon, I was sitting in the kitchen doing something trivial on my phone when she entered without making a sound. She didn't interrupt me. She simply moved around the space like it belonged to her thoughts. "I made tea," she said casually, not really offering it as much as placing it into the atmosphere between us. I nodded and took the cup when she handed it to me. That was the moment it happened again. Her fingers brushed mine slightly longer than necessary. Not enough for anyone to call it intentional, but enough for me to notice. Enough for my thoughts to pause for half a second too long. I looked up, but she had already turned away, opening a cupboard like nothing had occurred. The sound of cups shifting inside filled the silence, and I sat there wondering if I had imagined the weight of that contact. Then came the glances. Not frequent, not obvious, but when I spoke, sometimes I'd catch her eyes on me before she looked away. Not quickly, not guilty, just measured, like she was listening to more than my words. It started making me overly aware of how I spoke, how I sat, even how long I stayed quiet. Once, while I was helping my friend with something in the living room, she walked behind the sofa. I didn't see her until I felt a light pressure on my shoulder. "You're sitting too close to the edge," she said calmly. Her hand stayed there for just a moment longer than needed to adjust balance. Then it was gone. But the strange thing was, she didn't move away immediately. She stood there for a second, looking at the screen we were working on, her presence close enough that I could sense her without turning. "I used to sit like that too," she added softly, almost like she was talking to herself. That sentence shouldn't have meant anything, but it did, because it didn't feel like advice. It felt like shared memory, and I didn't know why that unsettled me. By the time I left that day, I wasn't thinking about what happened as separate moments anymore. They were starting to connect, small pieces forming a pattern I couldn't fully see yet. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just coincidence, just my mind overthinking simple interactions. But deep down, there was a quiet shift happening. Because now, when I thought about visiting that house again, I wasn't only thinking about my friend anymore. I was thinking about her silence, and how it somehow felt like it already knew me better than I knew myself. It happened on a day that looked completely ordinary. No warning, no build-up that I could clearly recognize at the time. Just another late afternoon inside a house I thought I understood by now. My friend wasn't home. That detail should have made everything easier, but instead it made the silence heavier. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels aware. I remember standing in the hallway, scrolling through my phone without really reading anything. My mind was somewhere between boredom and distraction, not expecting anything meaningful to happen. Then I heard her voice, not calling out loudly, not from a distance, just my name, spoken softly from behind me. I turned. She was standing a few steps away, closer than I expected. Her presence didn't feel sudden, but it did feel intentional in a way I couldn't immediately explain. She wasn't holding anything, wasn't in a rush, wasn't distracted, just still, looking at me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thinner than usual, like even small movements might change something that couldn't be undone. I opened my mouth to say something normal, something safe, but she stepped slightly closer before I could. Not enough to feel invasive, just enough to make me stop thinking about anything else. Her expression wasn't sharp or dramatic. It was calm, almost neutral, but her eyes, they carried something heavier than calm. Not judgment, not anger, recognition. "I know," she said quietly. 2 words. That's all it took for my thoughts to freeze for a second. I didn't ask what she meant right away. I couldn't. My body reacted before my mind did. My breathing shifted, my posture stiffened, my attention narrowing completely onto her voice. She looked at me for a moment longer, as if waiting for me to deny it, to escape it, to turn it into a misunderstanding. But I didn't, because the truth she was holding wasn't something I had ever said out loud. It was something I had only tried to hide from myself. She lowered her gaze briefly, then continued in a softer tone, almost like she didn't want the words to hurt more than necessary. "I noticed it a while ago," she said. "The way you try to act like it doesn't affect you." My throat tightened slightly, not because she was accusing me, but because she wasn't. She was understanding. And that felt worse in a strange way, because understanding meant she had seen past everything I used to protect myself. The hallway suddenly felt too quiet. Even the distant sounds of the house seemed muted, as if the space itself was giving us room. She took one small step back then, giving me space again, but the emotional distance didn't return with it. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her voice lowering even more. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. And then she paused. That pause lasted just long enough to make it feel like something more could have been said, but wasn't. Her words weren't loud. They didn't demand anything, but they stayed with me like a pressure I couldn't ignore. Because in that moment, I realized something I wasn't ready to accept. She hadn't just noticed me. She had been watching me long enough to understand what I was trying so hard to hide. And somehow, that scared me more than being exposed ever should have. After that moment in the hallway, I stopped feeling like I was walking into a normal house. Nothing outwardly changed. The routines stayed the same. My friends still joked around like usual, the TV still played in the background, and the kitchen still smelled like freshly made tea at random hours of the day. but I wasn't the same inside it anymore. I started noticing how I adjusted my behavior without meaning to, how I stood a little straighter when I knew she might be nearby, how I checked my tone before speaking, like every sentence now carried hidden weight. And most of all, I started avoiding her. Not directly, not in a way anyone else would notice, but subtly. If I heard her voice in the kitchen, I'd stay in the hallway longer than necessary. If she entered a room, I'd suddenly remember something I had to do elsewhere. It wasn't fear exactly. It was the discomfort of being seen too clearly, because she didn't treat me like I was invisible anymore. And that was harder to handle than being ignored. The strange part was that she didn't react to my distance. She didn't call it out. She didn't question it. She simply continued being normal. Almost too normal. One afternoon, I was sitting with my friend in the living room when she entered with a tray of water glasses. The light from the window softened her features as she placed them down carefully on the table. She didn't look at me immediately, but I felt it anyway, that brief pause in her movement when she came close enough to notice the shift in my behavior. Still, she said nothing. She just placed a glass in front of me. Her fingers brushed the edge of the glass before releasing it, and for a second, I wondered if she did it on purpose or if I had simply become too aware of everything she did. "Thanks," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the table. She gave a small nod and moved away. No tension in her expression. No sign that anything between us had changed. And that silence, it started to feel heavier than words. Later, when I was alone in the kitchen, she came in to wash a dish someone had left behind. Then, without turning fully toward me, she spoke. "You don't need to act different around me." Her voice was calm, not demanding, not emotional, just steady. I didn't respond immediately, because part of me wanted to deny it, to pretend I didn't know what she meant. But another part of me understood too well. She continued washing the dish, her movements unhurried. "I'm not here to make things harder for you," she added softly. That line stayed in the air longer than it should have. Ich glänzte her briefly. She still didn't look at me directly, but I could see enough of her profile to notice how composed she was. No pressure, no expectation, just quiet presence. And that was what made everything worse. Because her calmness didn't push me away. It pulled me into thinking about her more. After that, I left the kitchen without saying much. But as I walked away, I realized something uncomfortable. My avoidance wasn't protecting me anymore. It was just making me more aware of her absence when she wasn't there, and her presence when she was. And somehow, both felt equally difficult to handle. The rain started without warning that evening, as if the sky had been holding its breath all day and finally let go. By the time I realized it, the sound was already steady, soft drops hitting the windows, turning the house into something quieter, more enclosed. The usual background noise of the day felt distant now, replaced by the rhythm of water and silence. I had planned to leave early, but something made me stay. Maybe it was the weather. Maybe it was the way the house felt different when it was just the two of us inside it. My friend had gone out for something small, leaving behind a kind of emptiness that didn't feel uncomfortable anymore, just unfamiliar. She was in the kitchen when I first noticed the light had shifted. Warm, dim, calm. She walked into the living room, carrying 2 cups of tea, setting them on the table with the same quiet care she always used. Then, instead of sitting far away like before, she lowered herself onto the sofa, closer than usual, but not close enough to feel forced. Just present. "You stayed late today," she said gently. It wasn't a question, more like an observation she had been waiting to make. I nodded slightly. "It's raining." She gave a faint smile at that, almost like she understood more than what I said. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence between sentences that didn't exist yet. I found myself staring at the cup in my hands instead of her face, unsure of where to place my thoughts. Then she spoke again, softer this time. "You don't like silence, do you?" That caught me off guard. I looked at her briefly. She wasn't watching me directly. Her gaze was lowered, resting somewhere between the floor and the space between us, as if she was speaking more from experience than observation. "I don't know," I replied honestly. She nodded slowly, like she accepted even incomplete answers. "I used to think silence meant something was missing," she said after a pause. but sometimes it just means people are finally listening properly. Her words didn't feel like advice. They felt like something she had lived through. The tea in my hands had gone slightly warm, and I realized I hadn't taken a sip yet. My fingers tightened around the cup without meaning to. She shifted slightly on the sofa, not closer, not farther, just enough that her shoulder lightly touched mine. No sudden movement, no emphasis, just natural closeness, like it had always belonged there. And strangely, I didn't move away. "I know you've been avoiding me," she said quietly after a moment. There was no accusation in her voice, no disappointment, just truth, spoken carefully, like she didn't want it to hurt more than it already did. My chest tightened slightly, but I didn't deny it, because she was right. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," she added, turning her cup slowly in her hands. "That wasn't my intention." That line stayed with me longer than anything else she had said before. Not because it explained everything, but because it didn't try to control how I felt. A silence followed again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just honest. After a while, I finally spoke. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel around you." It came out quieter than I expected. She didn't react immediately. She just listened, letting the words exist without rushing to fix them. Then, very softly, she said, "You don't have to decide that right now." Her hand rested lightly on her cup again, steady and calm. And for the first time since all of this started, I didn't feel like I was being watched or analyzed. I felt like I was being allowed to exist without pressure. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, the space between us didn't disappear, but it stopped feeling like a wall, and started feeling like something we were both sitting beside, instead of on opposite sides of. After that rainy evening, something in the air between us changed, but not in the dramatic way I once imagined things like this would change. There was no confession, no clear moment where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, it became quieter, more stable, like a tension that had finally stopped pulling in opposite directions. I started visiting the house again without the same pressure sitting in my chest. Not because everything was resolved, but because I stopped feeling like I needed to run from her presence. And strangely, she never pushed for more than what I could handle. She simply stayed consistent. The same calm voice, the same steady movements, the same way she carried herself through the house, like she belonged to its silence. But now I noticed other things too, like how she never stood too close unless it felt natural in the moment. How she always gave space when I needed it, without making it obvious that she was giving space. How she never repeated the past conversation, as if respecting that some emotions didn't need to be reopened to be understood. One afternoon, I was sitting in the living room alone when she came in from outside. The sunlight was soft, falling through the curtains in warm lines across the floor. She paused when she saw me, then walked over slowly. "I brought something for you," she said. She placed a small glass of water on the table beside me, then hesitated for a second before adjusting something I hadn't even noticed, my shirt collar, slightly folded in an awkward way. Her fingers touched near my neck briefly, not lingering, not heavy, just a small correction, casual in appearance, but incredibly intimate in feeling. I froze slightly, not because it was wrong, but because it felt so natural from her that I didn't know how to react anymore. "There," she said softly, stepping back. "Better." I gave a small nod, unsure what expression I was supposed to have. She didn't wait for a reaction. She never did, and that was something I was beginning to understand about her. She didn't seek confirmation. She didn't need acknowledgement. She simply offered presence. Later that day, I found myself thinking less about what had been said between us in the past, and more about how calm I felt when she was around now. Not nervous, not confused in the same sharp way as before, just aware of her voice, her movements, the quiet way she existed in spaces without disrupting them. There was still something unspoken between us, but it no longer felt like a burden pressing down on me. It felt more like an understanding that didn't need translation. At one point, I caught myself sitting in silence with her in the kitchen while she prepared tea. No awkwardness, no forced conversation, just the sound of water boiling and occasional movement of cups. And I realized something unexpected. I wasn't trying to escape anymore. I was just there, not labeling anything, not defining anything, not forcing myself to decide what this connection was supposed to be. And neither was she. When she finally handed me the tea, her fingers didn't hesitate, and neither did mine. For the first time, I understood what she had been trying to show me all along. Not everything meaningful needs a name. Some things are allowed to exist simply because they feel human enough to stay. Tom didn't announce the way it changed things. There was no final conversation that marked an ending, no clear decision that closed a chapter. It just softened over time. What once felt heavy between us slowly turned into something steady. Not excitement, not confusion, not tension, but a quiet familiarity that didn't demand explanation anymore. I still visited my friend's house, but now it felt different in a way I couldn't fully describe. The space no longer carried that strange emotional pressure I used to feel when she was near. And yet, her presence still mattered, just in a calmer form. She never changed who she was. That was the most surprising part. She still moved through the house with the same composed grace, still spoke with that soft steadiness that made people listen without realizing it, still carried that quiet awareness of everything happening around her. But now, I wasn't reacting to it with uncertainty anymore. I had learned how to simply exist beside it. One late afternoon, I arrived earlier than usual. The house was quiet, sunlight filtering through the windows in warm, golden lines across the floor. My friend wasn't home yet. She was in the kitchen. I almost turned away out of habit, some old instinct that still remembered hesitation. But this time I didn't. She noticed me instantly. She asked gently, as if it was the most natural question in the world. I nodded. A few minutes later, I was sitting at the small table near the window, watching her prepare it without hurry. The sound of cups, the soft movement of water, the calm rhythm of something familiar. She placed the cup in front of me and sat down across from me this time. Not too close, not distant, just present in a balanced way that felt intentional without being heavy. For a while, neither of us spoke. And strangely, it didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt complete in its own quiet way. Outside, a soft breeze moved through the trees, making light shadows shift across the floor. Inside, everything felt still but alive at the same time. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "You seem more at ease now," she said softly. I looked at her for a moment, then down at my cup. "I think I stopped trying to understand everything," I replied honestly. A faint smile formed on her face, not proud, not emotional in an overwhelming way. Just gentle, like she understood exactly what I meant without needing more words. "That's usually when things become easier," she said. Her voice carried no expectation, no hidden meaning, just quiet truth. At some point, I realized I wasn't searching her face for answers anymore. I wasn't analyzing her tone or overthinking her presence. I was simply sitting there, and she was simply sitting there too. Later, when I stood up to leave, she walked with me toward the doorway like she always did. The same pace, the same calmness. At the door, she paused and looked at me for a moment longer than usual, but not in a way that demanded anything. Just recognition, understanding. Then she placed her hand lightly on my arm. A simple touch, steady, grounding. The kind of gesture that didn't ask for attention, but still stayed in memory. "Take care," she said softly. I nodded, and for the first time, I didn't feel like there was anything left unsaid between us. No secrets pressing down, no tension waiting to surface, no need for closure in words. I walked away from the house feeling lighter, not because something dramatic had been resolved, but because nothing needed to be forced anymore. Some connections don't end. They simply settle into a quiet place where they no longer hurt, no longer confuse, just exist as something deeply human. And that somehow felt like enough.